Hello friends, after a lot of requests, I have decided to make an analysis of a game where I beat someone much stronger than a beginner, in this case a 2300 rated player on Lichess. If you have seen the previous videos of this series, you will be able to compare the types of mistakes made by an expert in this video versus beginners in the previous videos. In this game, I'm playing white and I opened with the move d4. My opponent played d5, and here I went for the queen's gambit with c4. My opponent played c6, which is the Slav defense, and it's probably one of the best, or maybe even the best opening against d4 in the whole game of chess. Here white has a couple of main options. Knight c3 and knight f3 have been the most popular moves, and I would like to just name the difference between these two moves. They have slightly different advantages and disadvantages. Knight c3 makes the pressure on d5 even higher, and in a lot of the lines black finds it much harder to develop the light square bishop because of what we're going to see a bit later. Now, the drawback of knight c3 is that you have to learn how to play against dc4. Here you have to know that a4 is a very bad move, and with e5 black equalizes right away. White usually plays e4 or e3 with the idea of getting the pawn back, and here black plays b5, now a4, and our pony gets hit. So that is the drawback of the knight on c3, that it's a little bit harder to win this pawn back on c4. So white could play knight b1, knight a2, and knight e4, but you could just visualize how it's a little bit harder to get the pawn back. Again, white is completely fine here, you're still aiming for a slight edge, but you have to learn how to win that pawn back, and if you go wrong somewhere, black might end up just a pawn up. Now, if we play instead the move knight to f3, then there is less pressure on d5. And the drawback is, if you're playing the Slav with e3, which is, I believe, still the most popular way to play it, not gonna say the best because I'm not an expert on the novelties and the fashion of the highest level chess, with computers and all the best books involved, but e3 has been one of the most popular ways to play for many years, and here black would just solve the light square bishop problem right away. There is not enough pressure on d5, and if we're trying to do any kind of queen b3s, then here there is just not enough pressure on d5. So this queen b3 without the knight on c3 doesn't do any harm to black, and black is totally okay. Not to say black already has equalized, of course, but they do solve the problem of the light square bishop with more ease. So I decided to play knight c3. I like the pressure and I know how to react against dc4. My opponent plays knight f6, which is the most popular line. Here I go for my variation with e3, and my opponent plays bishop to f5. So now we're going to see why black can't solve that problem of the light square bishop so early, because white can play cd5, cd5, and now queen b3. And together with the knight on c3, that makes moves like queen c7, queen b6 rather impossible because the pawn on d5 is hanging. So for example, if they play queen b6, I could just take on d5, they take the queen, I take with the check, and then white is a pawn up. And it turns out that the best move here for black, and it is a playable move, and grandmasters do play that, is bishop to c8, and I will explain you why. Now, let's take a look at alternatives. Something like b6 allows us to develop the initiative with bishop to b5. And now, when black put a piece to defend, we can take on d5. So for example, knight bd7, and the pawn on d5 simply drops. If they play something like, for example, queen to d7, then here white again can develop the initiative with knight f3 and knight e5. You could visualize bishop b5 and queen a4, all of that coming. So these are not good positions for black. In fact, white can get quite a big advantage. So how come this bishop c8 is the best move here? Well, it turns out that without that hitting that pawn on b7, which stops hanging for black right now, this queen is not doing anything here. So while black is wasting the time to get the bishop back, in reality, white will eventually want to turn the queen back to c2 or d1, or at least in most cases, white will want, and so white will give the tempo back. So they're saying, okay, I misplaced my bishop on f5, I go back. But you also misplaced the queen on b3 because d5 is not going to be hanging and b7 is not going to be hanging. So there is not really much that the queen does here besides hitting those two pawns, which are now protected. So I played knight f3 and our opponent played knight to c6. And here there is an interesting way of playing the opening. I myself played with bishop to d3, but just want to show you an interesting alternative with knight to e5. So for now, of course, they cannot take because we're going to hit the knight and the pawn on d5 will drop. So for example, here you can visualize how the pawn on d5 is hanging too many times as the knight has to leave the protection. So they play something like e6, and now they might take. Again, there is just an option to do so without dropping a pawn. And white plays this with f4. So here we're hoping to expand on the king side and eventually maybe get a king side attack. And some games followed with bishop e7, bishop to d3, aiming of course at h7 where the black's king is gonna be, castles, castles. And here I have various rook lift ideas, something like bishop d2, maybe that bishop is gonna come to h4, and it's possible to visualize something happening on the king side. So that is one of the ways to play this, this position. I'm a simple guy, I play bishop to d3, and we have a lot of simple developing moves. So e6, bishop out, castle, rook fc1 trying to fight for the only open c file in the game. In most of the positions where we have only one open file, the player that wins the file is much better. So if I am able to win the file and say at some point invade to the 7th, that usually means black is in big trouble. Here black plays bishop d7. Now the pawn is not really hanging because of the tactics. For example, queen b7 runs into rook b8. And here after queen a6, for example, knight b4, just very, very, very bad position for white. Don't want to deal with that. I might drop a piece actually on d3. So we can just see how the Polish Grandmaster Wojtaszek, which was #1 for many years now, took the place of first, I believe, in Poland. And Wojtaszek played knight e5. So we can just see how the Polish Super Grandmaster played this position. I guess we have to play f4 again to protect e5. Black is trying to win the weak pawn on e3. Now knight d1 with hitting the bishop and defending the pawn. b6, h3 kicking the knight out at last. And with bishop b4 we're gonna swap our bad bishop for opponent's good bishop. And later he went on to win the game against 26-something Grandmaster. So an alternative to what I did in the game, and I'm a simple guy, I play knight a4. So the big idea of my move, which is probably not the best move for sure, whether it's good or bad, you can decide on your own, guys. I just want to play knight c5. So after I play knight to c5, I first of all improve my knight tremendously, and I'm hoping my opponent is gonna play b6. So if they play b6, I just try to make sense that the knight is no longer protected, so a square has been weakened, and rook c8 right now is running into bishop a6, which makes it harder for black to fight for the c file. So basically knight a4 is a provocative move, and maybe I would go even as far as going back and just say, okay, so the knight is no longer guarded, so perhaps there will be something around that. And also the idea of bishop a6 playing on the weakened squares, not allow this rook coming to c8 and challenging my rook on c1. And after knight a5, knight a4, probably the best way to play for black is knight to e4. I have weakened the square, so it makes sense just to jump on that. And in the game, I was deciding on going knight to c5. And my big idea, whether he takes with the knight or bishop, is to just get pawn majority on the queen side. So I get 3 versus 2. I want my queen to move, and then I'm hoping to create an outside pass pawn, and that's my way to victory. Of course, now Black has the middle, and so ideas like e5 and opening up his light square bishop and all that gives Black more than enough for counterplay. And I think it would have been a very interesting fight. So my opponent instead goes knight a5, which is a mistake. He decided to make a bad exchange, and that's all it takes pretty much to go very wrong, and I'm allowed to exchange my bad bishop for knight that has some potential to jump as well, maybe on c4 in some cases. And not only that, I get an easy knight c5. So I swapped my bad bishop for a knight. I'm not particularly very unhappy to give my opponent bishop pair. I believe the light square bishop is bad, but the knight on c5 gives me opportunities for all sort of initiative. And if they took, which they did, I was planning to take essentially with a pawn at first and get this majority of the pawns on the queen side, but here already like to fight for the file, come to the 7th at some point, and just capitalize with the initiative and finish the game. My opponent here played queen to b6, and I think that the way white should have proceeded, or I should have proceeded here after the game, I think knight to e5. So just developing the initiative, and these weakened pawns are, in the long run, I think they are not worth more than the open file and the knight on e5 and the play along the c file that I get with the rooks. I think that they're worth a lot more. I want to come to the 7th, start eating the pawns, and say after something like rook fc8 and rook ac1, I see a very big edge for white. So now I'm threatening to take and take on c8. So for example, takes, for example b6, rook c7, rook c8, and here everywhere there are ideas of developing the initiative. This is by any means not forced, but one of the possible lines that could have happened. Instead, I go with my own plan of trying to win the c file, so I retreat with queen to c2, rook fc8, rook c1, and here Black is under pressure. They have this bad bishop to solve as a problem, and also the c file. And if they took on c5 here, I plan to take with the pawn, again getting my majority with the plans of pushing these pawns at some point. On the other hand, if I recall right, because I'm thinking now, I definitely would not have thought of taking with the queen because b2 drops. The game is a couple of weeks old, so don't remember exactly all my ideas. So bishop to c6 happened, and the bishop for now is perhaps defending the pawns and closing the c files, but it's not for long because I'm coming with the knight to e5, and now I have big pressure on the pin along the c file. So rook a b8 happened. Their idea is that after this massive exchanges, they can win the pawn back on b2, and after queen c8 there is no mate because of knight e8, and so Black turns out to be equal. So I see what my opponent's intentions are, so I play a prophylactic move b3, so that in the same line my pawn on b2 wasn't hanging. And here Black already didn't know what to do. They played g6, and I took the pawn and enter a winning endgame where I still have a little bit of work to do. So my opponent keeps the queens with queen to a5, and the finishing move, for some reason I failed to see this in this not very long time control 10-minute game. Queen c7 just exchanges the queens, and it's a win on the spot, I think. The reason why it's so effective is because if they play rook b6 with the idea of keeping the queens, queen d8 just should win the game. I mean, there are too many threats coming against the Black's pieces. Starting with king g7, and now you could imagine all sort of rook c8, etc., etc. It's very bad. Well, I just wanted to get my back rank safe and not lose the c file. So a little bit passive move, but I'm still holding to to a big advantage that I think the position is winning in a practical game. Now we made a couple of prophylactic moves. I set up the pawns on the dark square so that my light square bishop would be good. Knight to e8. Now my opponent is preparing to try to win back or fight for the c file. King to g2, rook b7, queen b2. I think the moves are simple and not require a lot of commentary. I just offer exchanges of the pieces, and for sure my opponent should have maintained the queens with queen a5. It just makes it more annoying for white to win. His control over the dark squares and constantly threatening queen d2s, queen e1s make white to make quite a few prophylactic moves, and it's not so easy to push the queenside pawns. My opponent played queen b6 with allowed queen c5, and now my opponent shows that he has no way to improve his position, or at least he doesn't know, and starts playing king f6. Now, I thought there is no reason to exchange the queens if his queen is not threatening anything, so I just march my pawns as long as I can. So b4, pawn to a4, and now my opponent cannot hold the tension. I build this majority, and now the pawns are going to decide the game on the queen side. King e5, very beautiful move f4. His king has no way to enter the queen side unless he goes back. And now b5 and then b6. And here my opponent resigned and white won the game. So a little bit different game. I wanted to make a video for those of you who are a little bit more advanced chess players. I try to keep a good healthy balance and mix of both videos for amateurs that are total beginners and also experts that are a little bit more advanced chess players. If you did enjoy the video and the game, please do subscribe to my chess channel. If you would like me to make more such analysis, tell me about that in the comment. You can also consider hiring me as your personal online chess coach. My contacts are on the right. Thank you, friends. Wish you a peaceful week and see you in a week. Bye-bye.